各位书友，大家晚上好！欢迎
大家
来
来到
家做书局的直播间。本场讲座是《情动与物性》中国艺术中的情感系列讲座的第一讲。本系列的讲座呢是由佳作书局、芝加哥大学东亚联合举办，将邀请多位文集的撰稿学者共同探讨中国艺术的情感世界。系列讲座的第一场，我们非常荣幸的邀请到本书的主编洪之希教授。洪老师呢将以宋代描绘游鱼的为例，探讨中国传统绘画中鱼跃如何是被表现的。接下来呢，我们也将继续为大家带来更多的讲座。5月11号，借沈宇斌教授的最新假如苹果会落下塞上出版之机，我们邀请到沈宇斌、诸葛云3位教授展开对谈。5月26号，我们也将继续纽约大都会艺术博物馆合作，邀请到近期正在举行的策展人展开分享。大家可以点击左上角进入到我们的主页，在简介下方蓝色的视频号加入书局，未来更多的直播，查看往期的讲座回放。还请记得关注我们，随时获取更多信息，不错过更多精彩的内容。那么在等待各位书友到直播间的这段时间呢，按照惯例，我就先跟大家简单的介绍一下这本《情动与中国艺术中的情感》这本书，以及和芝加哥大学东亚艺术中心持续合作的东亚艺术史文丛这一系列的书。这本《情动与源于2022年芝大东亚艺术中心举办的同名专题研讨会，由本次会议的发起人与洪之希两位教授联合于2026年是一本精装文集。感兴趣的书友呢，也可以点击屏幕下方的了解更多书籍的详情。这本文集呢，聚焦中国艺术中被忽略的情感维度，将情感为一种动态的人与世界互动中产生的力量。它通过2个视角来观察，一个是情动，关注情感如何通过身体动作，比如观者的目光；另一个是物性，关注情感被物质世界所保存，比如器物上的这些纹路。翻开目录呢，我们便会发现这本书的研究对象跨度极大，从商周的战国铜镜到宋元书画、明清的印章，乃至现代漫画与民国面对多样的题材的编者，并未强求统一的理论框架，而是让14篇独立的文章叩问一个问题：我们该如何在中国艺术中看见情感？下面我们就通过文集中的几篇具体的文章来看看学者们搭建这座情的桥梁。首先，我们从封面这群游鱼说起，子非鱼之乐，庄子与惠子的哲学相信大家都很熟悉。但这个关于认知与共情的古老后世的画家又如何用来回应呢？宋元时期的画家得了一个巧妙的，他们不再描绘辩论的人，直接画鱼，通过捕捉鱼在水中游动的姿态，以及他们与水草呼应关系，画家们让一种关于自由悦的生命活力直接从画面中被观者的身体所感知。此时呢，绘画不再只是故事的插图，而成为一个能引 引发情感发生器。关于这一话题的视觉材料与研究呢，相信洪老师稍后的讲座为我们更加深入的。如果说由于从无到有的创造情感，那么墓葬艺术让我们看到古人如何将个人情感注入严格的框架之中。书中巫洪教授对公元前世纪孟公与和葬墓的分析，尤其令人动容。在那个时代的墓葬有着严苛的规范，但这对夫妻的墓穴呢，有一个孤立式的设计，两个棺材被安置成相处的姿态。随葬器物呢也成双配对，这并非理智的要求，而是生者为了表达同学的深情，在冰冷礼法的缝隙之中呢，留下一处温暖的悟性证据。与之呼应的是林伟正教授对隋代9岁女孩李进训墓的研究。墓志铭上何洁受邀的与他身边堆满的异域珍宝，无不是家人无法言说的悲痛被物化了。这些沉默的物质呢，恰恰诉说着最汹涌的情感。如果说古人在墓葬中的情感是含蓄甚至是隐忍的，本书对帝王的揭示了权力顶峰之上一种极为复杂的情感逻辑。在洪历墨宝的魏晋一文就分析了乾隆皇帝的艺术实践。这位追求华丽宏大的帝王在自己的绘画中却刻意能画得朴素，甚至笨拙。这些作品的价值不在于艺术，而在于他们是皇帝手记。他们记录的不是权力，而是皇帝本人。克制而真实的行为，华丽宫殿更动人、更情感、更复杂。从由于的灵动到帝王的克制，这本书正是通过这种情动与物性这两个交织的视角，让我们看到了中国艺术史中常被忽略的而深刻的情感维度。这本情动与物性呢，直达东亚艺术史从一贯的学术视野，这套文从呢是芝加哥大学东亚艺术中心长期合作的成果，已经出版了第11卷，这是目前最新的第11本。他所关注的是艺术史与视觉文化研究中最前沿的议题，比如摄影与东亚艺术，探讨了摄影术传入东亚视觉文化的深刻变革。我们也围绕当时的这本书策划了系列的讲座。感兴趣的书友呢，也可以进入公众号了解，又或者多元的屏风，则从物质性的双重角度重新审视了这一东亚独有的艺术媒材。这些研究或者拓展我们对东亚艺术认知的学术影响力，带到了传统学科之外。对这本情动与物性中国艺术中的情感，知大东亚艺术史文从感兴趣的书友，欢迎点击下方购物袋了解更多的详情。好的，随着越来越多的书友的直播间在讲座正式开始之前，我再跟大家介绍一下本场主讲人。洪老师是麦吉尔大学东亚艺术史专门研究中国期，也就是9到14世纪艺术与视觉文化。他特别关注我们如何感知世界。情与情之间的关系，出版专著《中国丧葬艺术的社会转变》和巫洪教授合编的这本《情动中国艺术中的情感》。目前呢，洪老师在研究一个新的课题，就是把面部看作一个中间地带，来探讨中国社会宗教和视觉文化是如何通过这个载体交织在一起的。相信通过洪老师今天的分享呢，一定能带给我们许多新的启发。接下来呢，就把话筒交给今天的洪之西教授。有请洪老师，Welcome。
谢谢大家好，谢谢大家好。首先感谢家族安排今天的演讲，还有谢谢各位收听我今天的演讲。我很高兴，能够分享我的文章。这本演讲以及出版书中的章节基础，但是最后一部分的内容未包含在书中。演讲结束后，欢迎人和反馈。最后我很抱歉，我用英语进行我的演讲。我觉得用英语来表达我的想法比较准确。感谢大家的理解。那么我就开始吧。How does one paint joy? This was a question that occupied the mind of the late 13th century painter Zhou Dongqing when executing a painting, Joy of Fish. What may sound like an issue that any artist would grapple with, Zhou's wonder was rooted in a specific positioning of emotion in the landscape of knowing that emerged more than a millennium before and was persistently passed down to his time. In the inscription written at the end of his scroll painting, Zhou aligns his inspiration for with widely known discourse of the joy of fish. Not being fish, I quote. How could you know their joy? By lodging the inspiration, I render it and completed a painting. Unquote. Zhou is clearly taking a conversation that occurred at the River between Zhuangzi and Huishi on how one could possibly know what the fish in water feel. Zhou then quickly moves on to his resolution, painting them. Rather than offering his interpretation on what had become an off-sided phrase by his time, Zhou shows the viewer how to understand what the fish feel. In fact, the pictorial mode Zhou Dongqing here was still something of a novelty. Before his time, a contrasting way of rendering the same episode had existed. The always extant painting of Li Tang's work here shows two men conversing, seated under trees on rocky riverbank. Based on historical records, we know that the paintings of this feature the two philosophers already existed in the 4th century. In contrast, the newly emerging pictorial mode excludes any signs of human existence and instead fills the pictorial surface with in their aquatic world. This I want to argue to a radically different approach to the question in the canonical episode that had circulating for more than a millennium. How did the painters indulging in this convince themselves that they were painting the joy of fish? On the one hand, the act of emphasized in Zhou Dongqing's inscription demonstrates the artist's self-consciousness about his own approach. On the other, it suggests a way of relating to the inevitable dualism in understanding others' feelings between the subject and the viewer and the knower and the knower in the Middle Period China. It is this newly open field of affective relations in the pictorial practice that I want to explore in this talk. There are several conditions that help new pictorial modes of picturing fish emerging during this time period. while they include new forms of leisure and public engagement with society among learned men. The thread of all developments was desire for knowing emotions, manifested in a way that painting could offer. Before diving into the water, so to speak, we may pause here to think about why painting swimming fish may have become relevant to this question how one can understand another being's emotion. In Middle Period China, knowledge on plants and animals operated under a certain set of distinctive from those of our own contemporary world. Flowers, birds, insects, quadrupeds, and fish were organized into vast epistemic systems of botanical and zoological categories by the Middle Period. They were conceived of as integral components of culture that links the contemporary to the natural world in antiquity. It is worth recalling that canonical texts such as Zhuangzi or Shijing are replete with images of nature. Numerous commentaries had been made on the potential meanings of natural subjects in such texts. Exegesis on flora and fauna in the classics that appeared in the 13th century revealed subtle variations in literaries' ideas about how to rate nature as a local cosmic phenomenon. Rather than interested in reaching unitary conception of the natural some world, scholars are drawn to the affective power of nature in itself representation. This was prominently manifested in the interpretations of especially in their views on the rhetorical device composed of natural image called or stimulation that opens each stanza in a poem juxtaposed without immediate connection to any human affairs around which the poem is situated. To take a quick example, fish amid water plants, Rizal, a key song in Shijing for understanding representations of showcases the use of Xin, here highlighted in yellow. I quote, the fish is at home among its water plants. Beautifully streaked is his head. The king is at home in how. Content and happy, he drinks his wine. It goes on, I'll skip the rest of the song as the structure is identical. Here, exemplifying a typical use of the image of a fish in its natural habitat initiates each stanza in which the fish's tail and movement are described. Each line of the Xing is led to a scene in which a king of ancient Western Zhou in the capital at enjoying a leisurely time and simply being comfortable in the place. The use of image of fish as a kind of allegory for had been firmly recognized by the Middle Period. But during the 11th and 12th centuries, traditional views on the provenance of Xin as a quintessential rhetorical device in Shijing were challenged. To some scholars, no longer alluded to human affairs. Shuche, for example, claimed that the poet's sensorial experience of nature stirred the emotion, regardless of its direct or indirect connection to the human narrative that followed the Xing. In Su's view, the natural image was something that a poet saw and was moved by. This is sharply contrasted from the traditional take on the nature in Shijing. That is, the image that was to become a metaphor or an allegory in human affairs in the poems. Zhang Chao declared that the Xing was something that a poet saw in a specific place, which was felt in his heart mind without premeditation. But the view's emergence in the Song period signals a new attitude toward nature and more pertinent to the ongoing discussion, parallels contemporary interest in investigating ways to understand how the natural world touch the heart and mind of the human dweller. Zhang Chao's inquiry into how stimulation from natural scenery is in the heart mind was an extension of his larger epistemological framework of Qing. The term Qing had been used in largely two distinctive ways by Zhang's time, that is, as disposition of things and events, wu, and what we now call emotions. Zhang's conception of Qing finds its place midway between the two poles, what I would call affective disposition, which was not an uncommon conception among the contemporary. One of the crucial terms to which Zhang Chao paid attention was qingzhuang, appearance of affective disposition. The concept is premised on the innate connection between a thing that one sees, its environment, and its viewer. In this scheme, that relation would somehow summon human affairs that would end up being written down in the rest part of each stanza. In Zhang Chao's view, the Xing as a literary device thus served as a transmitter of the appearance of Qing, as in qingzhuang. Such interpretation of natural image was modeled after the yearning for the connection to the very original affective power of nature. In other words, the representation of the entire circumstances in such a view paralleled the situation surrounding the creation of the poem. Both Su Che and Zhang Chao here reveal an awareness of the role of representation of Qing as a troubled affair. Unlike conventional views that still emphasize the Xing's role in stimulating emotions of the singer or the reader without questioning the mediate nature of words, these scholars were keenly aware of representation as a mediated concept. Their claim to own the entire situation of Qing, encapsulated in each poem, was an audaciously optimistic take on how to understand what others felt, in this case, poets from more than a millennium ago. Underlying their optimism for the immediate connection to the heart-mind of ancient poet was their strong endorsement for the power of seeing, jian. The core epistemological structure of this under-recognized approach to the natural world mirrors the workings of the minds on how to know fish's joy. Zhou Dongqing's confidence in the painter's ability to access the fish's inner feelings speaks to a cultural climate in which the role of sensory experience was considered genuinely as a process of knowing the world. Claiming to know the fish's pleasure, the painter was faced with the task of understanding how the feeling came to exist, or, to borrow Zhang Chao's term, understanding the qingzhuang of the fish in its habitat. To the fish, that word was water. The earliest traceable sign of deep interest in the question of the boundaries between land and water in epistemology and in art appears in a painting executed about a century and a half earlier than Zhou Dongqing's. Attributed to the Song official and painter Liu Cai, Fish Swimming Amid Falling Flowers introduces the viewer to a word that had not been available in pictorial field, water. As opening the end scroll, the viewer encounters a branch of a tree with pink petal blossoms protruding from the corner. The viewer here is positioned above the water. Two pink petals have fallen from the tree and are floating on the surface of the water here. Towards which several lissom minnows are flocking. As such, the painter reminds the viewer of the distance between the two words. Unfolding the scroll further, the viewer meets various kinds of fish that are dynamically moving around, including carp, catfish, perch, and shrimp, large and small. Grown fish are busily swimming along with the small, springing out of water grasses. It is a small universe. As one keeps unfolding the scroll, the varying scale of the creatures in each scene enhances a sense of underwater experience. It is as if some fish are lingering far away while others approach up close. The viewer's gaze, once outside looking in, is now in the water. For scholars of the time, a sight of fish in water almost always evoked Zhuangzian theme of the fish's joy, and the painter here was part of that culture. And yet, the artists who endeavor to represent this theme face a problem. If the painter wants to lead the viewer to know the joy of fish, should the viewer be located in the land or in the water? Not all painters engage this challenge. A series of accent paintings that share a pictorial mode featuring a group of swimming minnows show their content with the single dimension of looking in perspective. Scholars enjoyed fish watching, competitively building pavilions and ponds in their gardens for fish watching, and wrote numerous poems about the activity. For some, this was an aesthetic indulgence. For others, it was an allegorical device for discussing human affairs, which I will discuss later. In such settings, looking at the painting of fish was sometimes compared to watching real fish. Viewers of these images, such as the leisurely fish watchers, did not have to leave where they were standing, hence contently separated from the aquatic realm. By contrast, fish swimming amid falling flowers unsettles the viewers who are used to such boundaries between two words. Going back to the beginning of the scroll, the viewer's gaze passes the floating petals and lingers in the water, along with the fish and water glasses. The viewer here is once again reminded of her position by a lone peach blossom petal as an outsider, an observer of the aquatic world. A similar cue is placed in the later sections of the scroll, where a small cluster of lotus leaves is placed above a moving fish, under which a minnow and a red carp shyly enter the viewer's sight. The presence of water evoked by floating flowers and lotus leaves here pull the human observer back to the surface of the world. Textual records indicate that a cognate pictorial mode was practiced by another Song Dynasty painter, Liang Hui, a painter about whom we know very little. In Yang's work, the liveliness of the fish was heightened by such presence as fish, quote, mouthing willow catkins or making ripples amid peach blossoms, unquote. Observing through those intricate details, the viewers of Yang's paintings felt, I quote, as though they were on the bridge over the Hao River, unquote. A shifting sense of here and there was thus scrupulously crafted by the painter's brush. Underlying the conscious choice of such crafting was contemporary anxiety about how to and where to position the subject. Was it the knower, the one who knows, within the phenomenal world? How to interpret the last response uttered by Zhuangzi in the seminal episode of The Fish's Joy goes beyond the scope of this talk, but it is worth pointing out the significance of the placeness emphasized by Zhuangzi that had a lasting impact on scholarly minds in the next millennia. Responding to Hu Shi's questioning of, I quote, whence one could ever know fish's pleasure when he's not a fish, unquote, Zhuangzi declares that he knows it because he's at the bridge over the Hao River. The persuasiveness of Zhuangzi's argument lies in the connection between knowing and placeness. To middle period scholars, this sense of being in the place was not necessarily bounded by physical space, but by perception and perspective, especially relativity. For example, the philosopher Shaoyong was particularly attracted by Zhuangzi's approach to acquisition of knowledge. Against the background of the idea of phenomenal world as an ontological intersection among things, Shaoyong endorses Zhuangzi's attitude that one can be aware of individuated and united nature of existence at once. That is to say, fish bespoke a knowledge outside the realm of the purely personal. That simultaneous awareness of not being fish and yet being one with the fish was possible by being here at the Hao. Regardless of exactly how the last passage in this episode could be interpreted, the compositional crafting manifested in this painting signals the artist's envisioning of fluid positions for the viewer. For the painter, the viewer as the knower of the world could belong to both here and there at once, as long as she stayed on the visual journey through the scroll. The optimism of representation that we witness in the new take on the role of the natural image in Shijing during this time period is echoed here in visual terms. If the nature portrayed in the Xing sought to connect the reader to the total affective situation surrounding the ancient poet's emotional response, the painting of the aquatic universe here offered an understanding of the fish's feelings for the viewer. Reaching the end of the painting, the viewer's gaze is now back in the water. The appeal of this submerging mode was strong enough to continue into the next centuries, as rediscovered in Zhou Dongqing's Joy of Fish. Yet this time, the visual navigation in the water required a new paradigm of seeing. Zhou Dongqing's Joy of Fish presents a very different way of rendering aquatic creatures. Most obvious stylistic differences aside, the painting is understood with most obvious stylistic differences aside, the painting is unconcerned with how to invite and draw in the audience's gaze into the world of the fish. The hand scroll begins with a single catfish and a group of minnows enjoying themselves amid supple water plants. No branches of trees or flowers are in sight. The viewer is transferred immediately to the submarine world. The sense of bodily submerging is elevated by a seemingly irrational arrangement of fish in the pictorial plane. Whereas the previous painting displays a coherent perspective, assuming a single gaze, with every fish positioned as if it is viewed from the single point of view, at the consistent level, Zhou Dongqing's fish here are kaleidoscopic. From the very beginning, the catfish that the viewer encounters is positioned as if seen from the straight above, whereas the two minnows on its left side moving in the same direction are seen in profile. Just in front of them are two other minnows in circling movement, again positioned as if seen from above. Such juxtaposition of divergent perspectives repeats throughout the scroll. This seeming incoherence is deliberate. The painter was perfectly capable of rendering fish in subtle and complex angles, but chose to depict a few fish in a visually disjunctive posture. In such moments, the viewer's gaze is stalled and reoriented to a new angle. The results are remarkably dynamic. The mode reorders the surface in a way that the representational plane no longer seems to offer a smooth field reserved only for vision, and begins to open up a new dimension between the viewer's world and the pictorial surface. Seeing can move forward only if the eyes suspend their expectation of the coherent planal field. The viewer needs to give up being in two places at once through vision. She is urged to move around in consciously embodied gaze. The capricious movement in viewers created in Zhou Dongqing's work deeply resonates with roaming or rambling yo in Zhuangzian terms. This was recognized as a key term for understanding Joy of Fish episode by the Middle period. Underlying the choice of the term in describing fish's activity was Zhuangzi's perceptiveness to the link between humans' shared experience of walking and fishes swimming. To borrow the 11th century scholar Zhang Lei's words, I quote, "Wherever one finds joy in roaming is also where swimming fish find their world of pleasure," unquote. The painter's effort to contrive the condition of experience for the viewer, rather than focusing on mimetic representation, resonates with his self-consciousness about what an image can offer. On the one hand, Zhou Dongqing seems to have been particularly immersed in the image's relationship to word. The latter half of the self-inscription in the scroll makes a densely abstract turn, heavily relying on a classical discourse on the symbolic relationship between image and word in revealing the true meaning of what is represented in the painting. Let me start from the beginning. I quote, "Not being fish, how could you know their joy? By lodging the inspiration, I render it and complete the painting. If one desires to probe ordinary and profound meanings in such inspiration, one should discern image from non-image," unquote. The painter here enunciates that there are two different meanings to be found, some ordinary, that is obvious and perhaps superficial, others profound, that is deep and perhaps mysterious. A viewer seeking to distinguish the hidden meaning from the seen is encouraged to follow what Zhou Dongqing suggests, which is borrowed from Laozi and Zhuangzi discourse. There, the dyad of Shang and Wushang, as contrasting existences in the phenomenal world, had a strong connotation to image versus word as tools of representation. Among countless discussions of this ever-significant theme to many thinkers then and now, the 3rd century scholar Wang Bi's exegesis succinctly summarizes this particular discourse. I quote, "Without words, there is no image, and without images, there is no way to completely express the meaning," unquote. Wang Bi goes on to define the painting hua as a visual medium through which one's meaning can be manifested. Resonating with this line of thinking and clearly acknowledging that he was inspired by Zhuangzi's words that were put down in antiquity and transmitted to his time, Zhou Dongqing wishes his painting to be efficacious carrier of the meaning by placing his painting in equal terms with the words that have no form. On the other hand, the painter's insistence on the image's capacity as a medium through which the viewer experiences what cannot be spelled out in words is manifested in an idiosyncratic use of pictorial matter. Unlike the previous painting, here each creature in this underwater realm is depicted entirely in ink wash with strictly modulated tonality. Demonstrating the painter's total control of water and ink on the paper, each fish is rendered without any clear outlines and yet endowed with all plausible details of eyes, mouth, gills, and scales. Creating ethereal volume and yet keeping the painted subject bound to the same pictorial dimension, the ink wash in each detail imparts the overall bodies of the fish a sense of gossamer-like translucency. They are at once individuated from and united with their background. The picture thus translates the qualities of the ordinary, 中庸, and the profound, 傲, spoken by the painter. The rhythmic interplays between fully visible fish and partially invisible ones further augments such a draw of the viewer. Such occasional moments of invisibility challenge the viewer to realize the unique ontological overlaying between the paper on which the ink washes are applied and the water in which the painted fish are swimming about. And here, medium matters. Unlike in the previous painting, the water's presence here is implied persistently through the very dynamics of opaqueness and transparency. In making the waters working visible as ink, the painter materially and almost anecdotically connected the creating process to the relevant aquatic world. The effect of such neatly constructed condition for optimizing the viewer's somatic experience is a strong sense of intimacy. Thus materialized was aquatic abode for the fish, which is rendered fluidly weaving basic domestic components of willowy water grasses created throughout the space into the fish themselves, creating what might be called a topography of intimacy. Navigating through such weaving of the fish, water plants, and water, the viewer experiences a remarkable sense of fittingness, not only in terms of the viewer's proximity to the painting surface, but also in terms of her sense of belonging to the underwater home. This sense of intimacy built throughout the painting evanesces as the viewer's roaming reaches the end of the scroll. Her movement is stopped by a large carp vigorously turning its imposing body. The fish is most fastidiously drawn and also given a uniquely flashy tint, infusing the form with a life that no other carps in this painting bear. Combined with its visually arresting prominence over all the other creatures in the water, this carp is presented without a matching company, which suddenly changes the tone of the pictorial journey. With its singular presence, the entire underwater field turns out to be a world with hierarchy, where not all fish were born and existed equally. This mirrors the distinction between the common and the profound mentioned in the painter's inscription in the personified terms as well, respectively alluding to regular folk and the superior man. Rather than concluding the painting with a more traditional Zhuangzian note of pure joy, coterminously felt by fish and any human viewer alike, the painter signals yet another dimension, perhaps unsettled one, lurking beneath the equilibrium of communal pleasure. The dominant appearance of the single carp here can be seen as a sign that was growingly ubiquitous in the pictorial field, especially after the 14th century. Its personifying quality had a deep root in the equally dominant theme in the representations of fish that had been developing since the 10th century. The imagery of the fish featured in Shijing, fish and water plants mentioned earlier. A majority of recorded paintings with the title did not survive, but the theme of those lost paintings clearly derives from the classical topos. As mentioned briefly earlier, the sight of swimming fish in the painting often evoked the image of the ruler in his ideal kingdom throughout the Middle Period. And notably, it was also common practice that ever since the fish entered the pictorial field as an independent category of painting, painters specializing in the motif engaged both the joy of fish, 娱乐, in Zhuangzian tradition and fish and water plants, 鱼藻, in the tradition of Shijing. This theme of 鱼藻 was an especially appealing theme for those who sought for moralistic and political efficacy. The political dimension, in the sense of the public, embedded in the poem 鱼藻 was dramatically performed during the Middle Period. Back in the 11th century, the 鱼藻 was actually sung in the imperial banquet by officials for the emperor. As 11th century scholar Liu Yong's eyewitness account from the imperial pool, Jin Mingchi, describes, officials on their leisurely boats would sing the song 鱼藻 together as the dragon boat of the emperor appears. As an allegorical sphere where the fish is a Zhou dynasty king and his aquatic abode, the world he rules, the theme of 鱼藻 was securely connected not only to the literary space, but also to the public life of social elite. The large leaping carp shown at the end of the joy of fish was a harbinger for a new pictorial interest in the 鱼藻 imagery, embedded in the conspicuously displayed image of the joy of the many fish. Taking a pictorial cue from here, a distinctively original mode of rendering fish emerged in the next century. Two paintings feature a large carp swimming through water plants, one anonymous in the collection of Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and the other attributed to Lai An, a little-known Chan Buddhist monk, which is in the collection of MFA in Boston. The attribution in this second painting cannot be verified, but a Chan monk's interest in the subject was not an unusual thing at the time. Several colophons in the paintings of 鱼藻 theme penned by Chan masters have been handed down to us. Both works share a vertical format and composition that was becoming a new trend in the extended pictorial field. During the 14th century, various kinds of plants and animals began to be rendered in a conspicuously focalized manner within the vertical pictorial frame, be it a clump of lush grains, a menacingly staring tiger in the middle, or the soaring rock amid oceanic waves on the right. Iconography aside, the compositional interest here is largely shared with the paintings of a fish under discussion. Yet, there remains an important distinction between these two paintings in their pictorial components. The obviously different style notwithstanding, the carp in this Nelson Atkins painting is accompanied by 4 tiny minnows in the back here, easily fitting in the canonized hierarchy between the superior and its subject, while resonating with Zhang Zibei's image of joyful fish. In this context, the Nelson Atkins painting here can be seen as an example of such works that were formed out of and resonate with the political affect that the elite engaged, innately linked to their aspiration in the public life. The work in the collection of MFA in Boston depicts a single carp. The fish's solitary presence sets this work apart not only from the previous painting, but also from all the earlier modes we have seen by far in a significant way. The rendering of any aspect of fish's feeling in this painting, that is, communal joy or comfortableness of being at home, no longer relies on its relations to other fish. Unique scale and gaze of the fish create uneasy interplay between the two words. While exuding portrait-like quality, the unconventional scale of the carp in this painting does not conform to the standard components in the actual portraits of the time. Contemporary portraits were made in smaller than life or lifestyle. The fish in this work is larger than an average carp. So here I show you on the right is the actual painting, just to show you the scale of this painting. It positions itself in an undefined sphere belonging neither to the familiar planar surface of a painting nor to the reality. The exaggerated scale of the fish does not contribute to the doubling of the real carp in a static condition. Rather, it serves to simulate a transitory moment of encounter experienced when one is in motion, the kind of speed and change of scale experienced when submerged and swimming in the water. Pictorially, what the viewer's eye confronts is the face of the fish. The carp directly stares at the viewer with penetrating clarity, embodying a knowing and feeling face, and thereby turns itself into a being who communicates with the human viewer. Furthermore, the fish presents itself as a viewer, not simply the viewed. An unexpected human expression created through its gaze is at once unsettling and intimate. Unsettling because it betrays the normal sight of a fish in painting one would expect. Outside of the tradition of portraiture, it had been an uncommon experience for a viewer to encounter a painted subject looking directly back at her with such intensity. A rare example of figures staring directly at the viewer in intense gaze is a pair of paintings of Han Shan and Shi De, attributed to Yan Hui. The faces of these Chan tricksters were often depicted with demonstrably theatrical expressions as a sign of their holy foolishness in the Chan context. Something abnormal. While this painting follows such a pictorial cue, the painter's choice of the frontal view with their gazes directed to the viewer further empowers them. Having reached the status of the sagehood by the 14th century, the penetrating gaze of this figure resonates with their extraordinary ability to see through the viewer's mind. And yet, this ability is cladded in eccentric, almost disturbingly exaggerated grinning. We can consider looking back at the carp. The sense of penetration conveyed through the unexpected eye contact in this context was something of an aberration. Indeed, the unusually daunting glance of the carp is suggestive of the fish's metaphoric connection to the world beyond the everyday. The kind of bulging eye in the painting had been conventionally associated with figures of strange, foreign, or supernatural realm. Momentarily displaced from the world of the norm, the viewer finds herself with the staring fish alone in the zone of shifted control from the viewing to the viewed. The intimacy created therein is uncanny. It sharply deviates from the kind of intimacy felt in the other paintings of swimming fish, such as in Zhou Dongqing's Joy of Fish, in which the viewer's navigation in the water along with the fish formed a sense of spatial nearness, as if she's a part of that aquatic community. Here, the viewer is given a sense of improbable connection with the aquatic creature. The unexpected intimacy in this case is thus with another sentient being who has eyes and a face. It assumes the capacity of human-like feelings rather than only intimate with its underwater environment. The erasure of the borders between human and fish here develops an idea of the fish's knowing. The sight of the staring fish speaks to how the painter perceived the millennium-old discourse of Yu Zhao with noticeable sensitivity to how the public arena of joy can be expressed with a tint of unorthodoxy through the medium of painting. Staged as an unfitting portrait, the painting insists that the viewer becomes more than a simple observer of the mysterious realm. She becomes a co-conspirator of the supposed world of joy, along with the all-knowing fish. The timeless imagery of the harmonious and orderly world thus comes to conjoin the world of the viewer, here and now, rather than existing as some far-fetched allegorical image of the antique happiness. In this sense, the painting reorders the optimism of the immediate connection to the heart-mind of the ancient poet through seeing the nature that arose back in the 11th century. The connection has shifted from the Qing, as in Qingzhuang, to the body of depicted animal. The painted fish was no longer a static conduit of authentic yet fossilized feelings. It became the site of affect where the unfamiliar, unsanctioned feelings could be generated. Let me conclude. Whether such transcendental moment would have provided the viewer with pleasure, if so, what kind of pleasure, is an open question. It is difficult to draw any decisive conclusion about what social conditions drove the painter to render such a bold pictorial interpretation of the Yu Zhao discourse. A quick and uninformed attempt for explaining such a phenomenon might be to blame the Yuan Mongol regime since it's the 14th century, as if any negative emotions felt during the Yuan derive from the anti-Mongol sentiment. When I teach this painting, my students usually try to go to that direction, which is very problematic in my view. So far, I have not found such political impetus. What interests me the most for now is the capacity of the painting's affective mode itself that made possible unprecedentedly complex engagement with the viewer, traversing pictorial genres in emotional realms, social and religious. The feeling of contentedness and joy abundant in the literary discourses involving the swimming fish had always been framed as official emotions, to be shared by all under the sky. When painters of the Middle Period tackle the question of how they might convey the sanctioned feelings, their approaches varied from the one self-consciousness of dual nature of the locus of joy to the one completely embracing the possibility of experiencing the feelings through the act of painting, and to the one doubly abandoning the boundaries existing between two species and between two words. By the 14th century, the classical value of the public joy through the canonical image of swimming fish was thus put to a test, as the last example in this talk reveals. Rather than worked within the canonical components in representation, the painting served as an affective sphere where the painted image can deliberately betray the expectation of the viewer by maneuvering perspective or crossing pictorial genres and even species to a point where the sanctioned original feeling could be mutated into something else. That something in the fish amid water plants here was a mode of aberration and disquiet. The extent to which the viewer would detect such a sentiment would depend on the viewer's familiarity with existing modes of fish painting. For those who are versed, such sensibilities were identifiable in other paintings, shirking in the pictorial field outside the narrow genre of fish painting, echoing the very negotiation with the expectation, either by obfuscating the sense of the norm. Here I show you because unlike the normal view, this 14th century painting of a crab does not actually have one claw, or by displaying what is not supposed to be shown on the pictorial surface with certain degree of violence here, a devouring of another animal here, cicada, or decay, all in the antithetical exquisiteness, all from the same time period, which is why I chose these examples. With one glance, the staring fish transfers the viewer from the zone of expected joy to one of the uncharted anxiety. Thank you very much for your attention. 感谢大家的关注。
好的，非常感谢洪老师的精彩分享。今天我们跟随洪老师的目光呢，从庄子的子非鱼的古老的哲思出发，一路走进了宋元画家笔下那个充满生机的水底世界。我们看到了绘画如何从讲述鱼之乐转向呈现鱼之乐。画家们不再用言语来回答哲学的问题，而是用游鱼的姿态、水流的方向、水墨的音韵，让一种关于自由与愉悦的生命力直接从画面中溢出来。艺术由此成为一种能够引发共鸣的情感发生器，而这呢，也正是中国艺术史留给我们的那份穿越千年的动人情感。那么，在讲座过程中呢，有很多中途加入的书友呢，一直问直播间询问是否有回放。我在这里跟大家简单的介绍一下，怎么样观看本场讲座的回放，以及怎么预约未来更多的讲座。点击屏幕左上角的白色头像呢，在简介的下方会看到一行蓝色的小字，视频号叫做数据几个字，点进去呢就能找到本次直播的回放了。那么还可以看到近期所有讲座的一些预约信息，点击预约呢就可以了。那么接下来呢，我们进入到今天讲座的问答的环节，机会难得呢，大家也可以继续通过弹幕以及我们的书友群来向洪老师提问，一起跟洪老师进行互动。那么我们就来开始筛选今天的问题。第一个问题，看看啊，好的，第一个问题，洪老师，能否请您谈一谈，情感、情动与物性：中国艺术中的情感这本书啊，最初是如何发起的？您是如何想到要从情感这一角度来切入中国艺术史的？
我这个问题不太清楚，您可以再说一遍，还是只是解释
Could you tell us how the book Affect of Materiality, Emotion in Chinese Art first came out? What inspired the decision to approach Chinese art from the perspective of emotion?
是整个书。如果你读那个 introduction 那个这本书中的 introduction，我跟吴红老师，我们介绍那个研究情感的问题。I'm going to switch to English now. If you approach the emotion in art, it's not just about Chinese art, but all kinds of art history. You immediately encounter a problem of how to approach the emotion, because emotion itself belongs to a private field, which is something innate in a person, private. And so I have been thinking a lot about different ways to approach how to understand emotion in art, in our history especially. History is important because we're not talking about art critic or art criticism. So I have developed different ways to tackle this question, and over the years I have come down to two important components in understanding this study of emotion, which is one of the two is something coming out of the object or image, and the other one is something that comes out of the person who sees the image, basically. So that's why the title actually has these two aspects of affect and materiality, rather than trying to understand the emotion straightforward way. There's no way to understand the artist's emotion or any emotions that may exist in the work of art. Hence, we need these two aspects of affect and materiality. 我不知道您这个有字幕吗？
有，
有吗？
有的。好的，我们感谢洪老师的回答啊。我们继续，我们今天争取多问一点问题。大家对于本场讲座以及对于这个题目有兴趣的朋友呢，可以持续的给我们提问啊。好，洪老师，我们的第二个问题呢，就是您的研究主要集中在宋元时期的游鱼画这一传统呢，在明清时期是否得到了延续？如果有延续的话，与宋元相比，明清画家在表现鱼之乐的时候呢，出现了哪些新的变化或者是转向？
During the Ming-Qing, the late imperial period, from my research, I don't see any radical changes or new way of depicting fish compared to this time period that I study, from the, say, 11th century to the 14th century. A lot of paintings of fish basically repeat existing modes. So I would say repeat, but with some innovations. But from my research, this 14th century, these last two examples, this is the most striking change that we see in terms of the tradition of fish painting. 好的。
OK， 好，我们的第三个问题。宋代的思想家追求格物穷理，而画家呢试图捕捉鱼之情状。在您看来，穷理与体情这两种追求呢，在宋代的绘画实践中是如何交织在一起的
呃，是这个问题是两个观念是在一起，这个比较我不太清楚，这个问题不太清楚，您可以
嗯，好吧，那我们下一个问题，这个问题有
嗯。
点复杂。稍等啊，在您看来，认知愉悦与感受愉悦这两种不同层面的情感，哪一种更难被视觉化？画家们有没有发展出针对性的视觉策略来分别应对这两种愉悦？
对不起，再说一遍，对不起。
OK，在您看来，就是认知愉悦和感受愉悦，一个是认知，一个是感受，这两种不同层面的情感，哪一种更难以被视觉化、被画出来？画家们有没有发展出针对性的一种视觉的策略来分别应对这两种不同的愉悦？
对，但是我觉得这个两个，是我们研究这个题目的一种方式，这个分别不是我不相信那个一个画家、一个艺术家有这两种分别的，这个是
嗯
我们了解的时候分开这个两种。还是重要的是，关于这个娱乐这个 discourse，已经认识的问题比较重，我觉得，因为那个研究的历史上的那个历史家还是艺术家，他们的对这个认识的问题关注的比较严重，我觉得。比其他的文化其他的时代，我觉得这里的那个中古时期，艺术家的对这个问题关心比较高，是这样。
，OK，好的，我们再看几个具体一点儿的问题啊。周冬青的绘画试图让观者沉浸于水下世界，您如何看待这种沉浸感与今天我们所说的共情或者代入感之间的关系？古人所追求的沉浸与今天观众的感受方式可能存在怎样的差异呢？
是周冬青的吗？再说一
对。
遍，对不起。
周冬青的绘画试图让观者沉浸于水下的世界，您如何去看待这种沉浸感与今天我们所说的共情或者代入感之间的关系呢？
嗯，这个主动性是这个部分可能是不太清楚，我说话的时候不太清楚，比那个以前的绘画流彩的，这个是完全是水里面的。
嗯哼，
所以这里的那个照度没有包括这个两个照度分开的，就是整个那个照度都是从水里面的，这个是对吗？明白了吗？
，OK。好的，我们这儿还有一个问题啊，也是在问，周冬青完全弃用了线描，纯以水墨渲染，这在技术上与传统院体画有很大的不同。 除了视觉效果的差异呢，这种技法选择本身是否也在传递某种情感或者是态度？
嗯。I do think that this Zhou Dongqing's actually is very, very different, very new and innovative mode of depicting fish compared to any other existing paintings. Not only the ways that I wouldn't say the feelings 不是情感的，但是 affect 情动的。Zhou Dongqing's work is much more affective than the paintings of fish in the previous times. And that's why I try to emphasize the materiality and also the compositions. So it is not all about emotions, but really affective painting that Zhou Dongqing created.
OK，好，刚才我们直播间有一个朋友问到一个很有意思的问题啊，他说画家对鱼的关注与喜爱，如果把它迁移到同样是诸多文人画家喜爱的猫的身上，从猫的这个画像研究情感，从这个角度来讲的话，您有什么研究的建议吗？
冲帽是什么意思？冲帽
就是我们现在关注的是鱼，对不对？如果是猫呢？ If we shift the focus from painters' interest in and affection for fish to cats, another subject beloved by many literary painters, what research suggestion would you have for studying emotion through cat portrait?
So that 帽子。I mean, I'm most certain that there will be many different ways to study paintings of cats, but I actually personally do not think that studying certain paintings by the subject matters is productive. I don't think that's really productive. The reason why I focused on the fish, the subject of fish here, is because it actually has this much deeper historical weight of vigila. So, for example, if one can find a discourse related to cats, for example, that had been changing over time, as in the case of the fish painting, one can do the kind of scholarship, but I don't think it's about fish painting or cat painting. It's rather about, say, I'll give you an example. If I want to work on 11th century painting, 10th and 11th century paintings of animals and plants, then I think that can be much more productive than, say, just working on paintings of cats. So I would answer that way.
好的，谢谢洪老师。对，我们评论区也有朋友在说，猫在古代的意象和鱼完全不同，所以这个迁移会很困难，或者是不太可能啊。这是我们刚才有个网友补充的。那么下一个问题呢，是这位朋友问的，宋代是新儒学兴起的时代，想问老师，宋代的山水画和花鸟画。花鸟鱼草画啊，是与老庄的思想更亲近呢，还是与儒家的入世思想 更有关，就是老子和庄子。
It's actually this question. My answer to this question is related to my previous answer too, because the reason why Zhuangzi is important in this case is only because of the long history of the discourse of Rila. I don't think this has everything to do with Taoism or Zhuangzi, but it has already become the literary culture, much broader culture. So I don't think it's productive to separate Confucianism from, say, Confucian tradition or Li Xue from Zhuangzi. I think they're actually all connected during this time period.
好的，谢谢洪老师。因为我们直播间也有很多学习艺术史的学生啊，这个问题可能跟我们今天的题目稍微有一点距离啊。他说，洪老师，您最初是如何对中国艺术史产生兴趣的？那么对于现在做中国艺术史研究的同学们、学生，有什么样的建议？这应该是个比较年轻的学生啊。
所有的那个年轻的学者吗？well, I would say it's a very big question.
是的。
But given the context of this book and my talk, I would suggest that even though it may sound very obvious, I think it's just very important not to forget that we, our historians, have this opportunity and strength in terms of working with objects and images. So it doesn't matter what time period you study or focus on. If you are interested in certain material, be it painting or tomb material or anything, I think it's actually most important to be serious about what you see and how you experience those images. And everything else actually come with it rather than after experiencing and observing the art.
好的，谢谢洪老师。这个问题我来回答一下。他说，想问一下这本书的中文版、汉文版什么时候会出版？我觉得至少要2年的时间左右，或者是甚至更长吧。所以现在2026年的春夏27、28，我觉得至少28年的夏天以后才能出版。好的，我们下一个问题是，请问洪老师，如果我想要研究宋元时期的植物绘画，那么从情动这个视角，应该如何开展这方面的研究呢？
As I explained in the introduction to this volume, the topic of affect is actually, especially in Chinese art and East Asian art history, it's a very infant, a very kind of beginning stage still. In non-East Asian history, art history, there are more interesting scholarship. So I would say this is an exciting kind of new avenue for studying Chinese art, but very difficult one. I have to emphasize, unfortunately, that it's a very difficult one because it does involve a lot of different approaches, and you have to make a good balance among these different approaches. But the important thing I would emphasize is that it really is not about interpreting one's private emotion. It is about relations, relations between the image and the image maker and the viewer and the environment. So it is really multi-directional relations that one should focus on. It's a new, I would again emphasize that this is a new field of study in Chinese art.
OK， 好的，好，我们再问最后2、3个问题吧。那么黄老师，与文学史、思想史中的情感研究相比，艺术史中探讨情感有什么独特的价值或者不一样吗？
对。There is a really great scholarship by now in history of emotion, for example, in the intellectual history. And art historians certainly can borrow and learn from those scholarship. For example, there's the concept that I have been borrowing a lot, a very productive concept of emotive, which is based on the fact that any emotions expressed, once expressed, then those emotions cannot be any pure feelings. Once it's, departs from the person, basically, it's represented in any ways. So for historians working with texts, not images. So in 思想史 or the intellectual history, you work with a text that talk about someone's emotion. So-and-so is angry, so-and-so is sad or excited, so-and-so is in love. Those are in words. But the group of scholars who tackle those issues basically many decades ago became very critical of the approach that anyone can interpret and access to those emotion, the content of the emotion when they read these texts that talk about emotions. So this aspect is very well acknowledged, throughout the fields, any regardless of the disciplines now. But even for the people scholars who work with images, the question is even more difficult and more challenging because the trend, the scholarship in art history in general has been sort of moving away from anything subjective. And feelings, emotions by nature are meant to be subjective. So art historians can actually learn, on the one hand, we can learn from the approaches that anthropologists or historians of intellectual historians have been developing, but at the same time, that's not enough for us, basically, because we work with images. And the baseline is that even the texts actually do not answer your question about what this person in history would feel. So we have to always imagine that there are many, many different layers and also filters that we need to go through. Nothing is accessible, not to be a downer, but no emotion can be accessed actually directly from the representations. So 2 things, just in conclusion. We can learn from other disciplines the ways in which this affect is studied, but at the same time, we need to develop our own because it's a disciplinary, as I see it, at once it is a limitation and advantage that we do not, the words, the text do not determine what the representations actually of emotion can tell us about. So we do have advantage as art historian to access this unique challenge. Sorry, this 对不起太复杂。
好的，洪老师，我们下一个问题是，请问如果这大概也是一个学生提的，请问如果想要研究绘画之外的艺术，例如一些手工艺，比如说蜡染，如何去理解情动与图像之间的联系呢？
Oh, absolutely. I think there are already very inspiring studies, especially these objects. For example, object studies. Jonathan Hayes' work, Sensuous Surface, very much deals with affect through the what we call decorative objects, the things that we can handle, not the purely pictorial representations. So there are already some very inspiring studies that address the theme of affect, actually. So but again, the scholarship is just not, it's only the beginning stage as I see. So we can really see a lot of potential in, regardless of the mediums, be it painting or sculpture or whatnot. It doesn't have to be literary art, for example. So I think this field is very, has a lot of great potential.
好的，谢谢洪老师。这方面研究在可能20多年前就已经有一个乔训老师的研究了，感兴趣的可以去找来看看，并且这本书呢也在好多年前也翻译成中文版了啊，我忘记那个中文的名字了。我们下一个问题是，您认为绘画这种媒介在表达愉悦这类情感的时候呢，相比较于文学或者哲学的文本，有什么独特的优势，或者是说局限？
I'm not sure. Can you
What unique advantage or limitations do you think painting as a medium has in expressing emotions such as pleasure compared to literary or philosophical text?
it's a great question. It's a complicated question. I think it's not only about Chinese art. It is about art history. Again, it's about the advantage of art history. As difficult as it is, as I said, as I was explaining about how to get at feelings or emotions, we can be, if we want, we can be relatively free from codified expressions of feelings, meaning texture historians, I'm not blaming them, of course, it's a disciplinary distinction. People work with text. They have their own ways to go beyond this classified or coded terms. The terms do not translate basically into the what the content of emotion was when it comes to historians of text. The same thing, but for us, for our historians, and especially the painting, let's say compared to some other mediums, we do have unique materials and pictorial components. In this case, in my chapter here, my talk, we have ink, wash, water, paper, for example, that any texture description cannot reveal. So when we try to understand what the painter tried to express in Zhou Dongqing's work, for example, it's only because it's a painting done on the paper with very almost a very sensitive ways to maneuver ink. We can get at some kind of feelings of intimacy, as I try to sort of demonstrate, which really cannot be gained from reading someone's text. Because nobody would say, oh, I'm looking at this painting and I'm feeling the intimacy. We don't have the kind of textual sources, but at the same time, we can think about these possibilities because we have this painting that's made of particular material of paper, ink wash, and certain this expert techniques. So I would say definitely painting has its own affordability. It can afford things that other mediums cannot. So it's in itself, it's a unique medium, the painting.
好的，谢谢洪老师啊。刚才我们的直播间有书友记得刚才上一个问题的这本书的中文名啊，那本书的名字叫做魅惑的表面啊，应该是魅惑的表面，不是媚感的表面啊。好，我们下一个问题是，洪老师其实是在休假当中啊，我们今天把他抓过来，所以既然我们已经把洪老师抓过来，就多问他几个问题啊。西方艺术史中也有类似于情动的表达，您认为中国艺术中的情感表达与西方艺术中的情感表达最根本的不同在哪儿？是否存在某种不可通约的特质？
This is a great and very basic and great question. And in fact, I started working on this whole project with this question: what's the difference between the other cultural expressions of emotion versus the Chinese past? One thing that everybody notices, of course, is that in especially in European tradition, there are certain emotions that are very expressively represented in certain mediums. In comparison to that, the Chinese tradition, East Asian tradition in general, it's very subdued, a very kind of not very expressive, be it an anger or joy or anything like that. So, but the next step of my research was not about the culture sort of distinction, because everybody has emotion. It's really about cultural choice to represent something, some feelings in certain way. So, which is why studying the ways in which certain emotions are expressed in art can reveal a lot of things that we may not think about otherwise, to understand the culture, the past of certain culture. So I don't know if this is the answer to the question, but certainly there are very different ways to express, and even the degrees of expressing emotions in East Asian or Chinese culture. One of the easiest answers would be basically the kind of ritual codes or Confucian tradition where excessive or deep explicit expression of emotion is not encouraged, which is not untrue, I think. But that doesn't actually mean that all the representations we have from the past lack the emotional elements. So I think those are the differences. I would just leave it there.
好的，谢谢洪老师。好，我们下一个问题是，我们如何判断一件作品中的情感是真实的，还是某种表演或者是某种姿态？画家是否也可能在他的作品中去伪装情感呢？
This is a very good question. I will, rather than answering the question, I will give an example of, say, the one example that I show in the talk is Yan Hui's Hanshan Shide painting. And when I was explaining the paintings, I used the expression of theatrical. Theatrical in that context always means that there's something beyond it, something behind the surface. And even though this doesn't mean that it's fake, the ways in which we identify those sensibilities, for example, the theatricality of certain expression, which often involves exaggeration, something that's not so natural. There are ways for us to recognize certain things. Of course, when we do that, to some degree, we rely on our own contemporary sense of what is defined theatrical, what is defined natural. But we have to, as a historian of art, we always have to contextualize what we see in the time period. So the question is difficult, but I would say I would never think that there is the black and white answer to this question of, oh, there is something truthful and there's something fake. These lines are very blurry usually. And it is about how a work of art, how in each case representation, you see something, certain elements of society that made those expressions possible. And it is our job, a scholar's job, to identify what those elements are, rather than saying there is a truthful expression and then there is fake expression. So I think that's very, that way of viewing things is rather unproductive. So rather than that, I think it's more interesting to think about the relationship between the two contrasting modes of representation.
好的，谢谢洪老师。我们最后再问两个问题吧。对于情动与物性的研究方法，在书法、建筑乃至于当代艺术中依然有效吗？
Oh, absolutely. Actually, this volume does include many different kinds of mediums already and from different time periods. So there is architecture, great chapters about architecture, and also in terms of time period, we include also things from the 20th century as well. I would say it's the potential of working with the methodology of affect in modern and contemporary would be so much more accessible for the same reason as any historical studies, I think. So the answer is absolutely yes. The affect is not really, it's a methodology, it's a concept, it's approach. So it doesn't really matter what kind of medium you're thinking about.
好的，谢谢洪老师。最后问一个比较现实一点的问题啊，我们的听众呢有很多学习艺术史的学生， 或者是一些青年的学者，能不能请洪老师介绍一下麦吉尔大学您的这个学院或者艺术史系有，比如说在招收博士生或者是博士后或者是访问学者方面的一些情况，可不可以给我们简单的介绍一下？
Of course, thank you. So we do have a graduate program, both MA program and PhD program. It's rather small, and I myself have 4 and now 5 students. One graduated a couple of years ago, so we have a pretty robust program, small but robust program, and depending on a lot of situations, including the funding situation and my own schedule, sometimes individual scholars cannot accept students, but I'm always looking for good students. So I would say we have a great program. If anybody's interested in, they should look at the website and then study the program. And if you have further questions, I'll welcome any questions.
好的，如果大家对麦吉尔大学感兴趣也可以，应该是非常欢迎大家去申请洪老师的硕士、博士。大家当然可以通过学校的网站去做进一步的了解因为洪老师呢，最近开过好几个会议，并且教学的任务也非常的重，所以呢，在假期里面跟我们做这个讲座的活动以及组织，我们还有其他的几场围绕着这个主题的讲座。那么接下来呢，我们今天的讲座呢就到这里结束了。非常感谢洪老师的分享。洪老师，您还有什么要补充跟大家再说一下的吗？
没有，就是很感谢收听我的演讲，谢谢大家。
好的，那么我们就非常感谢洪老师今天的分享呢，也特别感谢大家的转发、分享和互动，给我们今天带来特别精彩的讲座活动。由于时间的关系呢，我们今天的讲座就临近尾声。感到意犹未尽的书友们呢，可以点击屏幕下方的购物袋来了解这一本《情动与物性：中国艺术中的情感》，以及芝加哥大学东亚艺术史文丛的其他相关的书籍。大家一定要注意，这本书是英文版本那么刚才也有朋友在问到中文版会有吗？我们认为大概至少要2年以上的时间才会有中文版想要观看我们这一次讲座视频回放的朋友们，也只需要关注我们的佳作书局的视频号，点击我们屏幕左上角的白色头像呢，就可以去找到本次直播的回放。也欢迎大家呢继续关注我们更多的讲座。基于这个《情动与物性：中国艺术中的情感》这本文集的出版呢，我们佳作书局也携手芝加哥大学东亚艺术中心，在洪老师的支持之下呢，也推出系列的讲座。今天是这个系列讲座的第1讲，那么接下来还邀请到其他另外3位文集撰写的学者呢，分享他们的研究成果，共同来探讨中国艺术的情感世界。那么欢迎书友们持续来关注这一系列的讲座。那么除了这一系列讲座之外呢，5月11号。借沈宇彬教授最新译著《假如苹果会落下》塞尚与在场出版至今呢，我们也邀请到沈宇彬、鲁明君、朱葛怡3位教授来展开对谈，欢迎大家预约。5月26号呢，我们邀请到大都会艺术博物馆正在举行的全美迄今为止最大的拉斐尔特展的策展人来展开分享。大家如果最近去纽约去大都会博物馆这场大展，也非常值得关注5月26号呢，大家别忘了跟我们的策展人来一起看看策展人分享拉斐尔。5月28号呢，我们将继续与大英博物馆合作，邀请到最近刚刚开展的特展早期尼德南绘画的策展人展开分享。最后呢 各位书友别忘了点击关注，预约我们的讲座，也感谢大家的关注和支持，期待跟大家在下一次的讲座中再见。我们也再次感谢洪之熙老师，感谢。
谢谢。
好的，洪老师非常的感谢啊，就是观众已经听不到我们说话了。